Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee here, and I am joined today by my guest and great friend and colleague, Susan Etlinger. Hi, Susan. How are you doing today?
Hi, great, Charlene. How are you?
Good. We have a fun topic teed up for today, which is about organizing for digital leadership. And for those of who are joining on the stream, would encourage you again to just chime in, introduce yourself, say where you're coming from, and also if you have questions along the way, I'll do my best to bring you up, and we can see that question and then answer them. So the topic for today is organizing for digital leadership. And one of the biggest problems that we have seen is that when we all had to go, again, can you believe it? It's been a year, Susan, that we
No.
we had to like shut down and completely change our businesses and pivot. And some of the research has shown that the digitalization of organizations has advanced 3 to 5 years, as we put into our intro. But we also think that just this digitalization and this move to digitize our work, to delivery of goods and services through electronic channels, all of that isn't enough. And Susan, your expertise is really around digital and data and this digitalization. Why is it not enough? What are we missing here?
Here's the question of the ages, right? March, whatever it was last year, and for all of us, or in some cases earlier, rolls around. All of a sudden, we're home. All of a sudden, Zoom is sort of the center of our lives. All of a sudden, companies who had not moved to the cloud start moving to the cloud, and all those objections sort of fall by the wayside. All of a sudden, new processes, all sorts of things start getting digitized. We have all this new data. And, we're still living in the world that we lived in for 2019 and the first part of 2020, where we don't necessarily, in a couple senses, we don't know what to do with that data yet. All of the ways that we measure success, that we measure progress, they all have to do with kind of other ways of doing business. And the other thing too is even in conversations I've had with executives around sort of how they've thought about evaluating their performance and their progress, they really struggle with the fact that we don't have established metrics around what productivity looks like in a digital environment, what leadership looks like in a digital environment, what employee engagement looks like. So for example, you can look and see that people are spending way more time in their business apps. They're spending more time in, Zoom and Teams and Slack and all this other stuff, and their business apps like, BI and CRM and all that other stuff. And so, you could say, well, is that productivity? Well, maybe that's associated with productivity, but you have to associate with something on the other side, right? An outcome to know whether it was just spinning our wheels, right? Taking more time, or whether it was actually meaningful. And so then what ends up happening are these little bits of insight where we look and we see, well, they're spending all this time, but maybe the results are about the same. Why? Because people are struggling. People are, they're kind of traumatized. So what ends up happening is that they identify something else, which starts to look more like burnout. And so I think why data isn't enough is that we have to have that experiential piece of it in order to be able to understand how to put that data in context. So that's kind of, for me, the big piece is, what does that new context look like?
And especially the context is the context externally and in an internal context too. So it's a bit of a complicated question. Your customers are changing, but your employees are changing tremendously. And one of the things we've talked about is the importance of that internal data, of understanding what's happening, again, from a productivity point of view. So I just want to take a minute, because what we're going to talk about next, Susan, is if this is the problem, how do we solve it? How do we create and unlock that value? And we're going to do it through the lens of strategy, leadership, and culture. But I want to take a minute. There's a lot of people who are joining from all over the world. So we have Mikin coming in from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia.
Wow.
Andy from just down the street. Well, both of us are in San Francisco. Andy Courtwright is down in San Mateo. So hi, Andy. Hello, neighbor. Crystal down in Monterey. And then Ignacio coming in from Chile too as well. And we also have Denise coming from Brazil. Rasul's coming in, Raj and Prakash. So a lot of people from all over the world. So very international in this stream here. So, Susan, let's go and figure this out. If this is the problem that we have all of this data, but we're not understanding that context, then how do we get better at this? How do we get to be better leaders in this digital space? How do we organize ourselves? Let's talk about strategy first.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what's happened and what continues to happen, and it's going to sound funny coming from me because I study data, is we're a little too in love with data sometimes. Somehow we feel that data has magic answers, and it may have magic answers, but what we need to do really is better understand the context in which we're operating. And so from a strategic perspective, that really means looking across all those various silos and understanding the way that we've constructed this data to fulfill a function and how that function has changed. So let me be really specific about it. We might look at data coming out of a CRM system. We might look at data coming out of like a Marketo or something like that, where we say, oh, look at this. We're doing all of this stuff. We're sending out all of these, prompts. We're filling our pipe. We're hopefully going to start to convert. We're going to start to get all these different things on the other side. The context of which is that, people may be reading information, but they may also not necessarily need that to develop that sense of belonging with the brand that they're interacting with, or that sense of trust. What they may need is something entirely different. And so in order to be able to make sense of that, if you have these very siloed, and we've talked about silos, since the beginning of time, but like now it's really, really important because we have to look at the same data from multiple points of view, accepting the fact that we've all been trained, depending on where we come from, whether we're in marketing or HR or product development, we've been trained differently. We have different metrics. We have different ways of establishing what it is that we do. And so strategy then becomes a question of sort of taking a pause for a minute and starting to understand what the signals actually mean. And that's really, really hard, right? Because it implies, or actually states outright, we don't really know what this new reality looks like. So I'm a big fan right now of thinking about how we can collaborate more. And you talk about this all the time. How can we collaborate more across silos? How can we let go a little bit of our very specific expertise in the service of a greater good and a greater understanding?
Yeah, let's talk about the silos, because this is actually the focus of my research right now with Altimeter, which is looking at saying, how do we create a 360 organization that's focused on the customer? Because we talk about seamless customer experiences, so being customer centric, and yet our organizations are never organized around customers. Very few are. And our data is in these silos. And so rather than trying to break down the silos, I think about building windows between them. Mm-hmm. And the problem is you don't know where to begin to build those windows without that context. And so the one thing that I have found to be helpful, again, in my research around disruption, is to focus on a future customer, because it's one thing to focus on your customer of today, but that future customer puts an extra layer of focus to say, how do I understand my customer across all these different places? How do I need to be there for them? And even pushing into this unknown space. And then wherever those uniting points are, these little windows you can start carving between them. But unless you have that focus and that context for your strategy, everyone goes and retreats back to their silos. They go back to the metrics, back to their legacy systems. So somebody said to me once, a very wise person said, this will never happen until the data is set, until you have a data lake, until you have full transparency into who the customer is. But the other side is you'll never get there unless you can break down the strategic intent that you need to be bigger than your silos and think about your customer across your organization. That requires commitment on the strategy side to be focused on the customer.
That's right. And one specific way of looking at that is, okay, so we can have all this data, for example, on how our marketing is performing. And we're like, oh gosh, views are down, or oh gosh, opens are down. So we send more stuff. And what's happening is that, we've got a customer or a prospect, with 3-4-year-olds on their lap and a dog barking and something else happening in the background and Wi-Fi is going down. And, some companies have actually used this as an opportunity. I mean, of course, the smart thing to do do is you sort of press pause, for example, on like your business as usual marketing in the midst of a crisis, but then think about like, well, what would be useful, right? And so one thing that one company did was to sort of extend the trial period on some of their software licenses, because they thought like it's just going to take people longer to figure out if this is a useful tool for them, and we're good with that. That's a service we can provide. And frankly, if this is a company that's moving into the cloud, from not being in the cloud, that has all these reservations, that maybe is even a small business, then this provides them, this is an assist. And we could think about that as marketing. I mean, of course, it is a kind of marketing, but it's not marketing in the way that we've normally sort of established it. Mm-hmm. So I'm really interested in the ways that companies are sort of, and people are being brave enough to stop in the moment and say, let's not do the thing we're comfortable with. Let's do something that is based in the reality in which we are living right now. And that's actually a really scary thing to do.
So let's talk about some best practices to put this into practice for the time that we have here. What are some of the best practices we could have around strategy, leadership, or culture? Again, leadership looks different inside of a digital space. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I want to kind of cover off though on strategy, because I think one of the other interesting things that I've seen in the past several months is really around scenario planning. And the importance of really understanding and accepting, because we're all so positive, right? Especially in the US, we have such a culture of being positive. Everything's great. Even if it's not great, we're going to solve it. It's a very kind of, very specific kind of cultural value that we have here. And and so financial analysts, they'll look and they'll say, okay, well, we're paid essentially to figure out what's the absolute worst, hairiest, nastiest thing that can go wrong. What is the absolute best possible outcome? And then what's the sort of middle ground? And maybe there's even a wild card, and the wild card is based on like, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if there's a political unrest? What if there's a pandemic? What if? And so that's lived in financial planning for a long time. But what it hasn't necessarily done is seeped out into the rest of the organization. And so I think, when we get into leadership, one of the leadership norms that we need to establish is around thinking about that worst, hairiest, nastiest possible thing that could happen, even if it's super unlikely. We're terrible at this. That will never happen. Why would we think about that? And yet it happens. It happened. So, so this culture of scenario planning, I think, is really valuable, and that actually requires us to sort of drop the facade of trying always to be like the positive team member and get into the nitty-gritty of it all.
Right. I love scenario planning, especially to get the people who are just skeptics about this. I call them the worried skeptics. They're constantly wringing their hands and going, no, that's not going to work. And then you can embrace them and bring them in like, well, why do you think it's not going to work? Let's develop a scenario around this. Yeah. And they feel, first of all, listened to and heard, right. And lo and behold, you have a risk mitigation plan over here now. Mm-hmm. So it's good all the way around because you need people like that on your team.
Yeah. In fact, I was in a, so Profit as our the company that owns Altimeter, and I was in a meeting once with a team where they came up with this, or they introduced this idea that was new to me that I just adore now, called the best worst idea. And so it was a kind of a creative generation ideation kind of session. So they're like, okay, so let's think of the absolute worst possible thing that that we could propose. And then there's always the germination of some kind of amazing idea in the absolute worst possible idea. And I think that ability to be just sort of not defensive about that and step into it is a really important thing.
Right. So the idea is there's no bad idea.
There's no bad idea.
No bad idea. It can be a great germ. I love that exercise too as well. Just want to say a couple of other hellos. A lot of other people are joining here. We got Prakash from Sudan, Ritu from San Antonio, Ricardo from Mexico City, and Natasha from Amsterdam. Love Amsterdam, lived there for 2 years. And then Dipling from Vienna. And the thing around the contingency planning is so key. But let's talk a little bit about leadership. Because when it comes to leadership, one of the biggest challenges is that we've had to go from leadership into in the physical world and really extend it into the digital world. One of the challenges I oftentimes hear from people is like, well, I can't see people. I can't, we don't have that sense of community. But after a year of doing this, granted, it's not the same, but it is actually different. And in some cases, actually better. One of the things I love about LinkedIn, about Zoom, is that everyone has a front row seat. And I believe it has created this sense that the power distance is less now between us and the various parts of our organization. So that there's a need for leaders to show up. And because they're showing up in such a visible and frankly, really tangible, they're right there with you in the same gallery as everyone else. It really makes them much more human. There's no escaping that. Your thoughts about how leadership has had to change also?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big issues, and this is also an issue around data and sort of digital life, is around trust, right? Because when you're a leader and you walk into your office in the morning or your work site, if you're on a construction site or wherever you happen to work, you have, what the what the intelligence services will call, or the military will call, situational awareness, right? You get a read on the mood, you get a read on who's there, what people are doing. Do they seem stressed? Do they seem engaged? Is there somebody off in the corner? And if you're a management by walking around person, you've lost that. You've lost all those signals. And so one of the things I've really heard from leaders is, this fundamental trust of their ability to suss out the environment has really degraded. And so as a result, earlier on in the pandemic, we started to see people over manage because they were worried that people wouldn't be doing their jobs. Many of them were then surprised to see that people were just burning out, right? They're working 20 hours a day and they're like working in waking up in the middle of the night and responding to emails and going back to sleep and stuff like that. So I think what this gets to, the sort of leadership imperative around trust, is this huge question is, how do you build trust in digital spaces, right? Zoom or, any of these other tools are really useful in terms of giving everybody the same size, rectangle. But then the question becomes, what happens behind the rectangle? What happens when the call is over? How do we as employees have the ability to understand sort of and read the room too? And then from a strategy standpoint as leaders, how do we then figure out the signals that we're not getting, and how can we start to account for that? And so it's like we have to relearn how to live in the world that we're living in, because the ways that we, with our senses, the ways that we have used to kind of understand our environments are completely shifted.
Right. I have a great question to this point. Ignacio asks a question. Do you see the next customer as a hybrid worker? So again, I think, Ignacio, and correct me if I'm wrong here, do we see the people we're working with to be hybrids? How do we see the world between working all in the office versus not in the office? And then also realizing that our customers may be working in lots of different locations too as well.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, it's the street cleaning.
Can't hear it.
Okay, good. So I did a series of research reports for Autodesk that kind of touch on this, that you can find at converge.autodesk.com. We can put that in the chat too. So I really like the term distributed work, as opposed to remote work or even hybrid work. And here's why. When we think about remote work, there's this assumption that there's a headquarters that's sort of like, the center of gravity, the center of power. And of course, not every workspace is an office. I do think that we're going to be working in a more distributed way. I do think that cuts across industries, but it's very, very specific. So if you look at, for example, distribution centers and factories, manufacturing facilities, people are there. They've been there the whole time. All the essential workers are there. Everybody's working in the same place. They're running these locations 24/7. They're pivoting to manufacture different things. If you're looking at downtown offices and, big cities and medium and small size cities, they're a ghost town. I do think we're going to have hybrid environments. I do think we're going to have to figure out how to do that. This week, my husband, who's a teacher, had to go back to school, and he is and teach. He is literally teaching in an empty classroom on Zoom to all of his students who are still home because they're practicing how they're going to do this hybrid thing. So I suspect what we're going to find is that people are going to there's going to be a pendulum swing, right? People are and some people really want to go back into the office because maybe they get meals there. Maybe they live, in some places people are living with their parents until they get married or whatever that might be. So I think it's going to be very specific, very culturally specific, very industry specific, and then finally very specific to the business that they work on. But for sure, it's going to be more distributed than it was.
Right. We're just much more comfortable with it now. And again, if you are in a retail environment, it's a different type of distributed in that you're now potentially doing a lot more through e-commerce. So Susan, what was the link to that? This is the future of work research that you did, right?
It is Converge, CONVERGE .autodesk.com. And you can find the research series there. And it just sort of explores a lot of these issues.
Great. I just put that up there so people can find it too as well in the stream. Awesome. Let's go into our last area, which is really around culture. And this is a big bugaboo, right? We sort of touched on this already a little bit in that our culture has fundamentally changed. There's no going back to 2020, 2019. The way that we work, the way that we believe have changed. And I believe that culture is a series of beliefs and behaviors that together create an understanding of how we will work. And if you don't like the culture, then you have to change your beliefs and behaviors. And again, to your point, we're going to be evolving that and changing that as we come back, because the way that we work and the behaviors that we see are going to be constantly changing. And that's going to put a lot of stress on the organization. I'll just start by saying I think one of the best ways to unlock value in this space with digitalization is with what I believe is openness, and the idea that more information needs to be not data, but the sharing of information, how information is facilitated. And Susan, I know you have some thoughts about how facilitation needs to happen inside of digital organizations by leaders. But when you have openness, you build that transparency, you build that trust that is so important. And then very importantly, you build this level of accountability. So you don't worry so much about how things are going wrong. You actually want things that are going wrong to surface so that we all can deal with it and make it better versus I'm going to hide it over there and hope that nobody notices that something went wrong. Your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think leadership really needs to change, right? Most companies, here comes a massive generalization. Many companies, many leaders, they think about performance. They have to think about performance, especially if they're public companies, they have shareholders, et cetera. I'm not arguing with the reality of how, economics works. At the same time, as we move to the cloud, as we gather more data, as we gather different types of data, so for example, new sensor data or other types of data, one of the one of the things that we need to think about is, how we make sense of that data and also how we adopt some of the principles of agile development that we see in the sort of cloud and technology world, right? And so the whole fundamental premise of these technologies is that you try, learn, and those of you who are, maybe work in marketing and have done like multivariate testing, that's part of your life, right? You're used to doing that. Other types of industries have not, like if you're building a building, you can't be like, oh, let's try it this way. No, let's try it that way. Like you can't do that in surgery, right? But this idea of continued agile, failure and success is really important because we don't know what the answer is on the other side. And so from a leadership perspective, that you have to have a high tolerance for failure. And you have to also be able not to play the blame game at the end, right? Because is the person who found the issue a hero? Maybe, right? Is the person who found the issue,
Yeah, that's a really good point. You're making the point that the thing here isn't to look for failure. I mean, this is what people who have issues around failure is like, I'm not trying to fail. No one wants to
Yes,
fail,
right,
right? I'm not going to go
right,
out there and I have an issue with people who say, let's go celebrate the failure. That's not what we should be celebrating. We should be
right.
celebrating the fact that that hero found the problem,
Hmm.
had the courage to raise your hand and say, let's go explore that. Let's go open that box. Who knows what we're going to find in it, but we're better off opening the box and not.
That's right. And there's a very public story happening at Google around precisely this topic, where people who found some, who had some very specific concerns about some underlying technology of Google's are in a lot of hot water, have been fired. They've reorganized the team and so on and so forth. And you can all read about this on Fast Company and VentureBeat and elsewhere. But this is one of the things that requires a really different kind of leadership. How can we move forward when we're learning things that may unsettle us? And how can we do that in a way that preserves our sense of belonging and momentum? Because years ago, I worked with a research firm, a research lab, and this research lab was populated by like people who had invented protocols that underlie the internet today. I mean, like incredibly accomplished people who had been working on this stuff since before the internet was the internet. And I asked him, like, what's your solution? What's your secret to like the things that you've been able to do? And he said, we've been working together, most of us, for 10 to 15 years. We know each other. We don't know each other intimately. Some of us hang out socially, some of us don't. But we have this level of trust and this level of momentum together that enables us to do things that we could never have done. And when new people come in, it really takes a while to do that. Now, you can't replicate that everywhere.
But that's what we should be aiming for.
But but it is aspirational.
Mm-hmm. I have a question, and then we're going to close up here. How will this be reflected? This is about the whole distributed workforce and HR policies, where some organizations had a requirement they had to be in the office.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Would this be reflected in national legislation? I don't think it is today in national legislation, or the fact that people may protect the right to not have to be in the office if that is a requirement or not. Your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a legal, and of course, it really would depend on where you are and what the regulatory structure is there. But I don't know that there's a legal requirement or that there's any kind of legal framework anywhere that talks about an employee's right to do one thing versus another in terms of the office. Also, in California, we're at-will employees. So, companies basically state the terms and we agree or we don't agree. So I don't think it's going to be if I had to hazard a guess, I would say I don't think it's going to be a legal requirement. I do think it's going to be a question of how are we as companies going to remain competitive when some of the people who are best at these jobs, who are the most accomplished, are not living, 5 miles from the place where we gather every day. And how are we going to manage through that? So I do think the onus is on the company.
Yeah, here's the way I think about mandatory. There are some jobs that are mandatory. You have to be in person. Surgery. The places where you may be collaborating around a design. And I was just listening to a podcast with Rebecca Minkoff, who makes designer clothes. It's really hard to make clothes and to look at fabrics and compare them in a design studio, not being in person. So you kind of need to do those things in person, but you may not have to do it every day. Again, hybrid. And there may be some jobs like in marketing. If you want the best person in the world to do that marketing, you may not have to have that person standing right next to you. So it really, I hate to say it depends, but this is what we're going to have to try to figure out. The days when you just dictated that 100% of people just had to be there. And frankly, I look at the people in Silicon Valley who they were putting up these huge buses to bus people from all parts of the Bay Area to go to a campus so they could sit next to each other and program their own stuff.
Yeah.
It was one of the most inane things. And they've all now said, we're going to be completely hybrid. If you want to work from home, 100%, totally up to you.
What's so interesting about that to me is this idea of us all having to go to an office and work. It kind of comes from the Industrial Revolution, right? It kind of comes from, and it comes from that old model of overseeing the employees to make sure they're not stealing, to make sure that they're working their full shifts and stuff like that. So it's really antiquated and based on sort of an entirely, hopefully, old method of thinking. But also on the other side, that's so fascinating to me is all these companies made this decision like when in June or something that they were just going to go entirely remote. These companies that were founded and predicated on making data-enabled decisions were just like, yeah, let's do it. So I think that's kind of hilarious, actually, because they don't know. We're just still in the very beginning of learning how to live this way.
Yeah. And with that, I think we're going to close off on that just really interesting point. Again, Susan, I just love your perspective that we're so all learning here. Any last words of advice? And also, please share with people where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Etlinger, Setlinger. I am also on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect. If you do connect with me, just put a little note so I know how you came to me, because so that I can kind of accept you. Sorry, that sounded weird. Accept you. My only final words are this. I mean, I think we need to cut ourselves a lot of slack, and I think that. Really what's most important to me in this past year is seeing the incredible resilience of people as we dealt with something that was entirely unprecedented in our lifetimes, and even in our parents' and grandparents' lifetimes in many respects. And what I'm hoping comes out of this, and what I wish we could go into more, is the value of people in all of this, that we shouldn't just decide that, I mean, data is great, technology is great. I work in this field, I love this field, but people are amazing. And I think understanding our own value and advocating for our own value is critically important. And if there was ever a time to do it, I think that time is now. So thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Susan, for being here. I so love our conversations. You can imagine what it's like to work with Susan. We have to like hold ourselves back spending all the time just chit-chatting. Please join me on Thursday, March 4th at 9:00 again for falling in love with your future customer. This is the next stream I'll be doing, just really talking about what it means, how to do this, and some really practical advice on step 1, step 2, step 3, how to get your organization to focus on that future customer. So until then, thank you again, Susan, for joining us here.
Thanks,
really appreciate
Charlene.
the time. And thank you, everybody, for joining the stream. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.